Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to another episode of the HTML Show with me, your host, Dan Pickett, co-founder here at Launch Academy. And the time has finally come. Episode 5 is going to start exploring the wonderful world of CSS. I've been promising for the last 4 episodes that once we got the structure down and once we started talking about sort of semantic markup and creating wonderfully accessible markup, that we would start to make it look pretty. Well, today is the beginning of that. And I couldn't be more excited to be with you here teaching you everything there is to know about CSS in making your HTML markup look beautiful. So today we're going to focus primarily on what's known as the style attribute. And we're going to be looking at how to set style up and use the basics, the very, very basics of CSS syntax to make that happen. Then we're going to pay particular attention today to adjusting the styling of text. So everything that we do in CSS can deal with the space in the box that elements represent, called the box model, which we'll cover in a subsequent episode. But today, just to get the basics down of CSS and everything that we want to accomplish with CSS, we thought it would be best to just focus on stylizing text. So that's where we're going to be oriented today. Then we'll start to look at how we can modify styles using the Chrome inspector. Just like we can kind of hack HTML of popular websites, we can do the same with CSS in cascading style sheets. So excited to show you that. And then we'll look at our markup and start to make some generalities as to why using the style attribute is actually a design problem and why it can introduce some smell or some unscalability to your code. And we're going to explore how we can make more modular styling happen in future episodes. All right, awesome. So let's dive in. So first we're going to start with the style attribute itself. So we have our web page here. If you remember, we've got everything from HTML headers and paragraphs all the way to HTML tables, which we kind of fumbled through in episode 4. So we've got the markup, we've got the structure. Now let's start to make it actually look pretty. And we can do so using the style attribute. And the style attribute basically permits us to use CSS syntax inside an HTML element. So if for example, I put a style attribute here on the H1 tag, I could set the color of my H1 here to blue. And let's take a look at what that actually does to our HTML web page. See that style attribute, which we used just standard HTML attribute syntax here, that's going to permanently change the color of our H1 element here. And in this case, I set it to blue. So let's talk a little bit about the CSS syntax inside the style attribute. So notice here that I've got a setting and then a value. And while with HTML attributes, we have this sort of style equals syntax, with CSS itself, we're going to follow this pattern of having a setting or a CSS attribute, and then we're going to follow that with a colon, and then we're going to have a value. And we can kind of change these things. For example, if I wanted to set the font style to italic, we can chain these things through the use of semicolons. So here we're seeing that I'm setting 2 CSS attributes on this particular H1 tag. I'm setting the color to the value blue, and I'm setting the font style to the setting italic. And we can go ahead and save this, just like we make changes to our HTML elements. When we're making changes to our H1 style here, we've got to go ahead and refresh the page. So when we go ahead and do that, we can see that change affected. Now watch what happens if I forget the semicolon here. None of my styles are observed because I have a syntax error in my CSS. So it's really important to consistently use that colon and that semicolon. And it's a really good habit, even if you have just one style rule that you want to set, it's a really good habit to always end it with a colon, so that a semicolon, so that I can later add attributes as we go. So see here, I've got 2 CSS settings, and I've set properties for color and for the font style, so that the resulting pretty H1 that I have here is being set to the appropriate style that I've set here in this style attribute. Now, notice here too that I can start to set style on any arbitrary HTML element. So while I've set the color to blue for my header tag, I've set the color to yellow in this case for this p tag. So let's see how that affects our changes. Wow, that's really hard to read. We're not going to want to keep that for too long, so let's just keep it red. All right, so we're getting awful patriotic here with our red and blue, but we've set our p tag style here to be red. So we can see how we've set the color there. Now, with the style attribute, in the way that we're setting our styles so far, if we want to affect this change to all p tags in our web page here, we have to do it manually and propagate all these changes to all of our p tags in the HTML document. So if I want all of my paragraphs to be red, I have to go ahead and populate all of my paragraph style attributes accordingly. So now I've modified my HTML web page so that each paragraph tag has the style of color red. Okay, so let's scroll back up here. And we talked about how we can adjust the color, but we can also adjust the background color of our HTML elements here. So if I wanted to set my background color in this case to, we'll make it Christmassy, why not? To green, watch what happens. So because my p tag is a block level element, it's going to make the entire line that the paragraph tag exists on green. Now notice what would happen if I used an inline element and I set the style background color to, let's make this one blue. So see how these style attributes tend to nest, right? So in this case, I've got a paragraph tag that sets the background color to green, which we see on this entire line. We have kind of overridden that for the span of my daughter's name, Ella, so that the background color for that particular text is blue. So we've set an inline style here to affect only the highlighted text. So here we've isolated a particular piece of inline material that I have isolated and set the background to blue. So we can use this mechanism to affect only specific pieces of content in the context of our larger p tag here. So let's go ahead and remove that for now, A, because it's ugly, and B, because we're going to talk a little bit more about color. So before we jump into getting more granular with the names of our colors, let's talk about font size. So with CSS, we can actually change the relative font size of our textual elements. So if I add another style here to our H1 tag, for example, if I set the font size to 12px, watch what happens. My H1 tag has now aesthetically been modified to match the text of all of our other text on the page because I've set the font size to 12 pixels. So we can use the font size CSS rule to essentially override the default stylings of our HTML elements. And in this case, I've set the font size of our H1 tag to 12 pixels. And let's talk a little bit about units and setting our font size here. So generally, when we're talking about digital styling, we tend to use px or pixels to represent the size in height of our HTML element. So here we're saying that we want our font of our H1 to be 12 pixels high. Okay, well, if we were using print, we might instead use the point unit. So notice that in this particular case, in the case of our font sizes, I'm using a numeric value, and then I'm proceeding that numeric value with either a px or a pt. And these have special meanings. In the case of the px, we're representing pixels, and with the pt, we're using the print value points, which is a different metric for basically specifying our font size. So I just made our H1 so tiny that you can't even see it. So let's adjust this point value to something a little bit more reasonable. Okay, 12 points, there we go. Let's see what happens when we set it to 20 points. Very good. So here we've set the font size to 20 points, but I want to talk a little bit about how we should be thinking about font sizes as we produce more complete HTML web pages. There's two other units that I want to focus on and use for the majority of the course, and those units are known as EMs. So let's make our H1 tag here an EM unit. So I've set it to 2 EMs, and essentially what I've done here is I've said I want to use a font size that is 2 times higher or 2 times larger than the base font size of any web page, any normal text on the web page. So we use EMs as a way to relatively set the size of our font for particular elements. So if I set, in this case, to 4 EMs, I'm basically saying that I want my H1 tag to be 4 times the size of normal text on a web page. So we can see as I adjust the size of our H1 tag, how it can get larger and larger and larger, right? So we use EM tags to basically make our font relative to the base font of the page. And so EMs basically kind of make our font sizes relatively large based on how we specify the numeric unit. So usually we'll have the tendency to use decimals in our EMs to kind of indicate that we want this particular H1 to be 1 1/4x the size of normal text on the page. So we'll see how that factors in, and then if we make it 1.5 EMs, how that adjusts the relative size as well. So we can kind of go up in these 0.25 increments and see how our text progressively gets larger. Now let's check out how EMs can get us into trouble. So we're going to leave that H1 tag, and we're going to reintroduce the span tag. And we're going to make the font size of this particular P to be 1.25 EMs. Okay, so, and I'm going to get rid of the background color here in the color for now, just so we can talk clearly and succinctly about the font size itself, so it doesn't distract. Okay, so you can see the difference between this paragraph tag and this paragraph tag in font size. Let me just bring my two windows sort of together so it's a little easier for everybody to see. So we see here that the first paragraph is 1.25x the second paragraph, right? So this paragraph that we've created and assigned style to is 1.25x the size of this paragraph. Now watch what happens if I set the font size to my span. take a moment and consider what you think will happen here before I go ahead and refresh the page. So I've set the style of my paragraph tag here to 1.25 X, and then I'm setting the size of Ella's name to 1 EM. So just take a moment and kind of visualize what you think that might represent. Now, you might have assumed or had the thought or visualization in your mind that Ella was going to show up smaller. Well, the reason why EMs are kind of weird and can get you into trouble is EMs are based relative to container elements. So in this case, where I'm setting the font size to 1.25x, my span tag is basically using that as the relative to set the EM size. So if we wanted this to actually get smaller, we'd have to use the REM unit. So let's use the REM unit and see how Ella has now become a smaller font size. So EM is used for relative font expansion and contraction, right? So in this case, when we had it set to 1 EM, the actual observed font in the absolute sense of the page is 1.25x, right? So that's because this EM is relative to the container, which is the paragraph tag here. So 1 EM is basically translating to 1.25x. So if we want to use absolute font sizes, which I recommend in general, we would go ahead and we'd use the REM unit. Now the REM unit is going to base the styling in the font sizing off the sizing of our root element. So that's why there's an R in the unit. It's based off of the root measurement. So if we want to set a base size on our fonts, we want to do so in the HTML tag. And so we'll set the style here to a more specific and static font height. So here we're setting our font size to 12 pixels. So all of our REM measurements are going to be based off of that 12 pixel font sizing. So see, my page in general has gotten a little bit smaller, but we can see here how our paragraph tag is still at 1.25x, and Ella, the name here, is exactly 12 pixels in font size. So in general, we recommend the use of REM units once you've set a base style of font size on the HTML element. And later in subsequent episodes, we'll show you how to do this a lot more cleanly. But for now, you're going to always want to set a base font size either in pixels or in points to basically anchor your font sizes so that all of your font sizes can be based off of that using REM units. So the long-winded summary of this is set a base font size in your HTML tag using pixels or points. And then if you want to adjust the relative font sizes of everything on your HTML web page, use either EM or REM font sizes. And in general, Launch Academy recommends the use of REM font sizes. And what's really cool is this will become particularly useful when we start to do things with responsive designs, which basically allows us to modify the styles of our HTML web pages based on the device that the end user is currently browsing your page on. All right, so that's about what I wanted to cover for font sizes today. So go ahead and set your font size absolutely in that HTML tag, and then set all of your relative font sizes using EM or REM attributes. So let's go back to color for just a moment. If you remember, we set our color of our H1 tag to blue. And we can use the names of colors pretty readily and pretty easily in our CSS attributes and CSS rules. But most of the time, you're going to notice the use of what's called hex code to express our colors. And this is a wonderful web page I recommend checking out, htmlcolorcodes.com/colorpicker. And I'll go ahead and send this in the Slack channel so that everybody has it. And basically, as a web developer, we have the tendency to express our colors in this funky syntax. And this funky syntax boils down to essentially mixing the red, green, and blue primary colors in the context of sort of digital media. So you may have played around with tools like Adobe Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator or the open source tool called GIMP, right? These tools all use this sort of similar color palette UI, and it uses a combination of numbers to basically reflect how much red, green, and blue is going to go into a color. And if you remember from your kindergarten days, if you mix red and green together, you get yellow. And if you mix green and green and blue together, you get a sort of cyan color, we like to refer that to as. And if you mix red and blue together, you get purple. So it's through this color math that we're able to express colors in a digital way. So in most graphics programs that you use, you're going to specify a certain amount of red, a certain amount of green, and a certain amount of blue from the numbers 0 to 255. And that actually represents a 256-bit color palette, right? So what we want to do is we want to basically translate this information into a more succinct way of expressing a color in the context of our HTML and CSS. So you may have seen this syntax of a pound sign followed by a series of letters and numbers. And this is known as a hexadecimal format. So it's a way of expressing a number from 0 to 16 using characters for all of the numbers 10 through 16. So you can use a combination of the digits 0 through 9 and the characters A through F to basically represent 16 digits of color. So I can say here that I want to take away all of the color to make black. And if I wanted to express the brightest red possible in the most intense red possible, I could do so by specifying a full 16 on both digits for the red of our hexadecimal color here. Now, if I wanted to be all green, I would do so by setting FF in the middle two digits that represent green. And if I wanted to be fully blue, I would do so by setting FF on the final two digits. Now, I can pick any number in between 0 and F here to reflect maybe a less blue color. So for example, if I wanted to kind of take the blueness down, I could go down to 99, and what we get is a little bit of a darker blue. And if I go all the way down to a 3-3, watch how much darker that gets. You can almost not see the hint of blue here. It almost looks completely black, right? So we can adjust the combination of colors here to basically represent how much red, how much green, and how much blue we incorporate into our coloring and in our CSS. So if I wanted to use this navy blue, let's actually make it a little bit more bluer so we can see it. Instead of using the name blue in our style attribute here, we can specify the color using this hexadecimal syntax that we just learned. So I've just said here that I've specified my color to have no red, to have no green, but to have a little bit of blue, to have a 6 over 16, so that's like 30-40% blue, right? So let's see how that affects the color of our H1 tag here. So see, before I refresh, it's bright blue. I've just made it a little bit darker. And we can play around with these colors to get a feeling for how these hexadecimal digits intensify the blue on our web page. So notice that this 0000FF translates to the color blue that we had originally on our CSS rule here. But in most cases, you'll see web developers and web designers express their colors in this hexadecimal format. And one thing to note as well is we can actually shorten or abbreviate this particular color by eliminating the redundant numbers here. So here, if I wanted to just express it using 3 numbers, I've gone ahead and shortened the expression here to reflect the same thing. But the important thing to remember is that I don't always have to have the same digits here. So I can actually be even finer with the color controls that I'm introducing here and decrease at a micro scale the amount of blue that I'm contributing to this particular style element. So play around with these colors, get familiar with this hexadecimal syntax for basically adding colors together. Notice here too, we could do something like this and make it a cyan. And one thing to note about this hexadecimal coloring is if I use the same numbers across my red, my green, and my blue, I'm gonna get some kind of gray. In this case, I got a very light gray, almost to the point where it's not very readable. But if I go ahead and I use, say, all C's for my color, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Make sure you always have 6 characters if you're using the 6. You always want to have either 6 or 3 characters here. And notice that that gets darker. And the lower I go in numbers, the more dark my gray is going to get. So that's almost close to black, right? So a little primer on hexadecimal math and how you play around with colors, but by far the best way that you're going to familiarize yourself with how you adjust color using this hexadecimal format is to kind of play around with this scale and see how it affects the numbers in the calculations for the numbers as you work through different hues and shades of colors. But know that 000 is going to result in a completely black, and FFF is going to result in a completely white palette. So every color is a combination of red, green, and blue expressed as this hexadecimal number. Cool. All right. So we've talked about color. Let's jump into talking font style and weight. Font style and weight basically allows us to adjust beyond the sizing, beyond the coloring, but things like bold and italics, or things like underlining or striking through our text. So if you've been in a word processor and you've underlined certain text or italicized or bold certain text, you can do so using the font style and font weight CSS rules. So let's continue to play around with this inline element here and see what happens. We'll get rid of the font sizing for now and make it consistent. What happens when I add font weight bold here? Watch what happens. Now Ella is bolded and the rest of the text is kind of standard. If I want to apply this font weight bold to the entire element, I have to do so in the P element itself. Font weight bold. That's interesting. Font weight bold. Let's get rid of that. Oh, see here, I've got 2 style attributes here. So the Chrome web browser is only interpreting and taking into consideration the first style tag. You can only have 1 style attribute per element. So here it's reading in the first style element and ignoring the last one. So I made an error here. I've got to combine these 2 style attributes into 1. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So now the whole HTML element is bolded. And this span tag then kind of becomes redundant and or useless. But if I wanted to make Ella, for example, italic, I could use the text decoration or the font style property. So now Ella is italicized and bolded because it also inherits the rule of its container here. So the container is basically saying I want you to be 1.25x the font size, and I want you to be bold for everything that's listed underneath the p tag. And then the span itself is setting the style of making it italic. So you can start to see where the C in CSS actually comes from. There is a cascading nature to the relationships of styles. So the font size and font weight properties that we've set in this p tag actually goes down to this span element. It cascades into it. So Ella is affected by the style rules that we set on its container. And I'm just gonna check in on questions and see if we're good on questions. Looks like we're good there. Awesome. All right, so we set the font weight and we set the font style. We can also set text decoration like so. Thought it was text decoration. Well, this is a good seg into the resource that I'd recommend. And just like we use the MDN, or Mozilla's Development Network, for our HTML resource, we would also recommend the MDN for our CSS rules. And you can click in and get perspective on all the things that you can do with CSS using the MDN documentation. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to go into the developer tools. Oops, sorry, we're going to go into the CSS here. And this exhaustive reference is going to give us all of the things that we can set from a CSS property standpoint on our HTML elements. And here I want to basically strike through Ella's name, and I thought it was with text decoration. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the text decoration property here and see what our options are. So you can see how we can get our text decoration. Okay, I was getting my wires crossed. We can actually set our text decoration to underline, not strike through. And this is going to underline Ella's name. So we use text decoration to underline. We can use text decoration to do other things as well, like overline, line through, and blink. So let's make Ella blink. Looks like Chrome doesn't support the blink value. But let's try overline. And this is going to get the strike through or the overline effect that I was going for. Let's do the line through to get the strike through. So we can see how CSS can start to really affect the way our styling works here and the way our CSS appears. All right, so let's move on, but for now, know that you can look at the MDN and get all kinds of perspective on how you can adjust fonts, text sizes, font weights, font styles, and the whole getting a feel for what works for bold versus italic versus underline just takes a little bit of practice and playing around with the rules and exploring the rules here. This reference I go to often. I will also share this in Slack so that people have it. Oh, looks like Spencer is a step ahead of me. It's just a wonderful, wonderful way of getting familiar with all the things that you can set using CSS properties. All right, cool. So we're going to get rid of the line through and we'll change Ella to just be underlined for now. Let's talk a little bit about text alignment. So text alignment, if you remember in the Slack chat room, we've been talking a little bit about how you can center text and you can align text to the right or to the left. Using block level elements and the text align attribute, we can start to align text based on where it is relative in the browser screen. So if, for example, I wanted to align my H1 here to be centered on the page, I can do so using the text align property and setting it to center. I can also set the text align to right so that my H1 is right justified. Well, that's cool. Let's go ahead and center our H1, and let's go ahead and align our P tag to center. Now notice that these are block level elements. So our H1 and our P tag here are block level elements. I cannot text align an inline element. Notice that my text align right here has no effect on Ella because it has a relationship with a block level element. So this text align is not going to actually affect change on inline elements. You can only use text align for block level elements to define how things are aligned. So if I change this and I remove this and I move it, for example, into this block level element, now it's right aligned. Notice that the CSS is being interpreted as rightmost being most important. So this rule gets eliminated or ignored by the browser. We can also adjust the space of the white space in between our paragraphs using line height. So line height gives us the ability to adjust the white space between the lines of our paragraphs. So let's go ahead and add some more text. And this is known as lorem ipsum text. And we use this in publishing and design quite a bit just to add some filler into our web pages. So now my paragraph is really, really long and it's got some filler text into it because I want to demonstrate the capability of this line height styling rule. So as you might guess, if I set my line height to 1 EM, it's going to really not affect the change, any change on our web page. But if I set my line height to 1 1/4 times the height of our HTML using an REM unit here, watch how this changes in my browser when I refresh the page. This paragraph, watch. Line height 1.25 REM. Let's make it more dramatic. Oop. So for example, we'll set it to 5 REMs. Notice the change in the line height for this inline element. I've changed it so that there's huge white space between the first line of the text of the paragraph and the second line of the paragraph. And the reason is because I'm only setting that on the span. If I want that kind of white space to take place on the entire paragraph, I need to move this rule to the block level element. Now we get huge white space from line to line for the entire paragraph. So let's make that a little more sane, and we'll make it, say, 2 REMs. So that's the equivalent of double spacing in our word processing. Cool. All right. So let's just talk one more thing as it pertains to setting fonts and changing the fonts of our HTML web pages. There's this whole idea in science, in design, called typography. And we can use typography to call attention to certain elements of our page and to make our page look prettier. So right now, I believe, based on the flags that you see on our I's and on our M's, by default, the browser is using what's known as a serif font. And that basically means that there's some decorations and it's just a fancier font than what we may be seeing in a typical word processing document. So if I wanted to change the font, I would do so using the font face styling rule. And I could, for example, set my H1 to use a serif font or a sans serif font, which basically means without the flags. And we could, for example, set it to Arial. That should be changing our font here. So let's open up the Chrome Inspector. And like we can edit our fonts and our HTML elements using the Chrome Inspector, let me make this larger for everybody. We can also adjust our CSS and styling using the Chrome Inspector. So we're going to modify our style here in the Chrome Inspector. So here we've set the H1 tag to have this font face, and it looks like it's not being observed. So we've got our HTML on the left side here, and we've got our styling here on the right side. And we can play around with all of these rules in real time to change the styling of our HTML web page. So for example, if I was playing around with colors, I could make this all red and see what that looks like. Let's make it a little more. So you can see, just like we can modify the text of our HTML, we can also modify our styling on the fly just to get a feel for how it looks. Now, just like any other modifications we make in the Chrome Inspector, if I refresh the page, that change is not persistent. So we only use the Chrome Inspector to basically test out some changes. We want to make sure that any changes we make in the Chrome Inspector actually get affected in the actual document itself in our code editor as well. Okay, so we're playing around here and we're trying to figure out why the font is not working. So we could go back to our CSS reference and look at our font, and I was using the wrong name. We want to use the font family rule here. So we're going to use the font family rule and get that right. And see, now my the font has changed from a serif font to a sans serif font, and it's going to first try to look for Arial on our system, and if the Arial font is not installed on our system, then it's just going to fall back to a generic sans serif font. And there's a whole world of typography to jump into that's sort of out of the context of our course here, but just know that you can set fonts using this font family rule. And you always want to specify either a serif or sans serif fallback, so that if the user doesn't have a particular font installed on their system, then it always has a reasonable fallback so that aesthetically it still looks decent. And later in the course, we'll talk about how you can actually point to external fonts and use external fonts in the latest versions of HTML. So very exciting. But for now, you have to rely on what's known as web-safe fonts, which are fonts that are commonly used and installed across Macintosh, Windows, and Linux systems. And Arial, Helvetica, and Times New Roman are all generally fonts that you can rely on having installed on the system. And the MDN article on font family will talk quite a bit about font safety and what fonts you can use and how to set fallbacks and things like that. So I highly recommend you checking that out. All right, so we've dove into the specifics of CSS and how we can set aesthetics using the style attribute. But you can imagine that, like we've demonstrated here with our red paragraphs, that setting our style attributes in this way can be really, really verbose. And if, for example, I want to change all my paragraph tags to blue, well, I have to go all through my elements to do so, which is kind of a drag, right? So I have to edit all of these style attributes to blue. So where are our other P tags here? Blue. So I have to edit that in multiple places. Well, wouldn't it be great if I could just assign and specify a rule that would allow me to color all of my P tags blue? Well, in the next episode, we're going to discover and explore the world of CSS selectors so that we can make generalized rules about the styling of our web pages. With the style attribute right now, we're very specific and we're very isolated to this particular instance of the P tag. With CSS selectors and class-based and ID-based selectors, we'll be able to make more and better generalizations around how we want our web page to look. So check us out in the next episode, and let's just check in on questions and see where we are on those. All right. So the question was from Nathan was, we use the semicolon to link multiple styles, but not on the last one. In general, it's a good habit to always end your property value lists with a semicolon. So that way adding additional rules is super easy. So you don't have to have the semicolon there. This is equally valid and will pass the validation process. But it's just a good habit to always add the punctuation so that you have it. All right. So we looked at styles. Now I would love for you to add some styling to your web page, start to make it look pretty, start to play around with those hex color calculations using this color picker tool. And I hope you'll send us a screenshot and your HTML for your web pages so that we can all learn together. I'll see you next time in episode 6. Thanks and have a good afternoon.